Great. Great. Thank you, everybody who's attending to come to this evening webinar, supported by Farm in the Future, work involving RSPB, Nature Friendly Farming Network, Pesticide Action Network UK, CoFarm, and the Soil Association. It's really good to hear for this boosting beneficial insects on farm with an IPM approach. The basis behind this and the session we did last week and the other two that are following on later on is that everyone knows that IPM is something we should be trying to do. We know there's going to be an IPM standard in SFI or ELMS coming forward. And one of the issues that we are noticing is a lot of farmers are saying we want to do it, but we don't know how. What we need is support from researchers, and we need support from farmers who are currently doing it. Peer-to-peer learning support, going to see people doing webinars, people's experience, good and bad, of this is the way that we are going to move this forward, to move away from the dependence on pesticides. As an organic advisor, we don't use pesticides of any form, but we understand that they are very useful at times. So let's see if we can get nature to work better so that we can be on top of it and pesticides become the last resort, not the first resort. I'm not going to spend any time introducing the speakers. They're going to explain them, talk about themselves as they go through on their presentations. Anything to say, if you do have any questions throughout anyone's presentations, put them into the chat. I will then ask the speaker after each one, and if there's any really interesting broader questions, I will leave them to the end so we can have more of a panel discussion. Okay, so we're hoping that everyone can get involved into this discussion. Okay, so straight away, I'm going to hand over to Dave George from Newcastle University to explain some of the research science behind the IPM approaches we want to take on board.
Excellent, many thanks, Jerry, and hello to everyone. Good evening. My name's Dave. I'm Newcastle University, and I guess I've been working in IPM for probably about the last 20 years. And as you can probably guess from my wall decorations at home, I'm an entomologist originally, although I've branched out a bit since and work on a sort of range of projects. But my initial research at Newcastle many years ago, when I began my research career, was looking at how we can use trap cropping and companion planting within fields to give us a level of pest control. And since then, I've worked on various projects. And I'll hopefully highlight a few of those with a few slides, really to provide a bit of a platform for discussion later on, and hopefully a bit of an introduction to the subject for the other speakers to build upon. So I shall attempt to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that okay. I will just start the slideshow. Yep, somebody nod. You see that? Yeah, excellent. Right, okie dokie. So I'll dive straight in. So this is a slide I like to start with. If we didn't have any kind of natural checks on pest populations, within 12 months, we would have 200,000 million descendants of one pair of houseflies covering the Earth to a depth of 15 kilometers. We would have the descendants of one aphid mother coming in at 250 million tons, circling the equator 1 million times, and the descendants of one pair of cabbage whites would be shooting off into the stratosphere faster than the speed of light. So there's some quite good alarming figures to hopefully wake us all up if we've just had a big tea. Fortunately, we do have those natural checks on pest populations, and we don't see pests exploding necessarily to those sorts of numbers. One of those natural checks, and it is just one of them, we have other checks like bad weather, for example. Those figures I showed in the previous slide assume that everything's perfect for pest development, which of course it never is. But one of those natural checks, and something that I've worked on quite a lot in the past, is beneficial insects. So we've got a selection of them here across the top. This is by no means a complete selection of them. You'll see some obvious ones that are missed out there, things like parasitoid wasps, for example. But species like hoverflies, ladybirds, predatory beetles, predatory flies, spiders and harvestmen, and wasps of various kinds can all provide an excellent pest control service for us. And we've actually, for a few years now, started to put values on that service that they can provide, which we call an ecosystem service. So we've got figures there for pest control. We've also got figures for pollination, of course. That's another, depending a bit on which crop you grow, it's another vital service that you can benefit from on farm. However, there's a slight issue there, because in order to access these benefits that we can obtain from beneficial predatory and parasitic insects, we really need to develop systems that can support them throughout their entire life cycle. And large-scale monocultural farming systems don't necessarily do that very well. And that's because all of these things at the top there, all of those species, really throughout their life cycle have a requirement that goes beyond just the things that they can find in the average crop field. So if you're a hoverfly, for example, you cannot reproduce unless you have had access to a floral resource. You need pollen before you can really go and lay any eggs to produce those larvae that will be very good at predating aphids. And even for things that we associate as being very, very predatory, things like ladybirds, for instance, that will munch away on hundreds and hundreds of aphids throughout their various life stages, will still benefit from having access to additional resources that you wouldn't necessarily find in a crop field. And again, floral resources can be an important one for them. And even if they don't have an absolute requirement for them, providing those resources can do things like increasing fecundity, for example. So it might be laying more eggs. It can help those insects to live for a longer period, so they can munch away on more pests as they do so. Unfortunately, if we don't provide those resources, we don't really provide for the full life cycle of those beneficial insects. And as a result, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we don't necessarily see too many of them in our crop fields, or certainly not as many of them as we could see if we did provide those resources for them. So we're not really benefiting as much as we could from that ecosystem service of biological pest control driven by those beneficial insects. Unfortunately, this system that we see here, and I don't want to be dismissive of monoculture in any way. It's done a fantastic job over past decades of increasing yields, allowing us to feed a sort of growing human population. But what it has become is a system that's absolutely fantastic for producing pests. So on the one hand, it's not a system that's very good for producing the things that will eat those pests. But on the other hand, it is a system that's very good for allowing pests to find the crop in the first place, these huge areas of a single suitable host plant. If you're a pest insect looking for somewhere to get a meal or lay an egg. And once a pest is in that system, it's very hard for it to lose a suitable host plant. If it gets knocked off by a raindrop or blown off by a gust of wind, it's going to end up next door on a plant that's just as suitable as the one it was on. And particularly when we start to factor in things like the sort of relatively recent developments of pesticide resistance in many key pest insects, what we've essentially done is designed a system that's absolutely perfect for pests and not very good for the things that eat them. What we can do, and again, what some of my work has focused on in the past, is we can look to reintroduce some of those resources that pest natural enemies need to perform well in farmland systems. And we can do that certainly introducing flower mixes in some way, usually as a flowering field margin, but you can also introduce them in other ways, is one way that we can go about filling those resource gaps that those natural enemies face at the moment, to try and promote their numbers and give them the energy that they need to perform on farm. It's not quite as simple as that. It's not quite as simple as throwing some flower seed around and hoping for the best. Not all seed mixes are necessarily created equal. And there's just a couple of graphs here that show if you take something that's been designed to benefit pollinators and contains the sorts of flowers that bees, for example, might be attracted to and be able to feed from, it doesn't necessarily do very much for other things like parasitoid wasps that might give you that additional benefit of biological pest control. And that's exactly the same if you flip that on its head and you design something for biological control, it may not benefit pollinators. So a few years ago, well, probably more than a few years ago now, we started to look at trying to combine, trying to stack those benefits from a single flower mix. So it's not something that would be any harder to sow or any harder to establish, or even indeed any more expensive. But by combining the right sorts of flowers, we were able to start to stack those benefits to promote both pollination and pest control as ecosystem services that we could derive from beneficial insects. And there's just a link there to it's quite old now, but a fact sheet that we did for AHDB. Something else that we did in that work that's important to consider is that we also look to minimize the risk posed by flower mixes. And by that, I mean, if we put the wrong sorts of flowers in depending on the crops that are within the rotation that will be next to that flower strip, there is the risk that we disproportionately benefit pest insects over the good insects that might help control their numbers. And certainly a good example of that, if you are growing brassicas, you don't necessarily want to be feeding too many cabbage white butterflies. They're one of your key pests on that crop. And some things like knapweeds, whilst being fantastic for promoting biodiversity in general, can be a very good food source for cabbage whites, and admittedly on quite small scales. But when we've done some experiments, we've actually found increased pest numbers when we've put those sorts of plants around small plots of brassica crops. So you do have to be a little bit careful there and put a little bit of thought into that mix to get the best from it. If you do that, and if you can get that right with something like a flowering field margin, you can find that you certainly near to the flowering field margin, you can do things like reduce the numbers of aphids that you'll be seeing. So in this graph here, we've taken some samples at 5 meters, 50 meters, and 95 meters from what we call a multifunctional flowering field margin. And we've got data there for the mean numbers of aphids and the percentage of them that have been parasitized by these tiny parasitoid wasps. And you'll see that near the margin there, we've got increased parasitism and we've got reduced aphids per plot. But as we start to move further distances into the crop, we can start to lose that effect. And certainly looking at where we position our flowering field margins, potentially whether we actually put some of those within the field as corridors, or to enable pest insects to move outwards from them, is an interesting area, and I think probably one that others will talk about, so I won't dwell on it too much here. And it's also the case that in addition to flowering field margins, it can also be important to consider other features as well, such as overwintering habitat, for example, for certain beneficial insects, and making sure that they are somewhere within the landscape for them if they need those sorts of features. Something I've looked at quite a lot, going right back to my sort of companion cropping days at the start of my research career, was looking at whether we can start to not necessarily just do strips through a field of an additional flowering field margin, but whether we can actually start to move away from monoculture entirely to diversify field centres completely through things like companion cropping or growing crops in green living understories. And there's a couple of examples of that here, one with clover and what looks like a cereal potentially, and the other one is probably an example that a few of you might be familiar with, oilseed rape with berseem clover, which looks to have a relatively beneficial effect on suppressing flea beetle damage. And the reasons for that could be twofold. You could have some of these green understories that might be attracting some of those beneficial insects further into the crop, and potentially providing them with some resources that they need while they're there, like nectar and pollen. They wouldn't necessarily get that from clover. But actually, these sorts of systems can function for pest control, even if they don't encourage predators and parasitoids, because they help to confuse the pest insect whilst it's trying to locate its crop plant by diluting it a little bit in the landscape with other plant material that's not suitable as a host plant for that insect. And just to highlight there, a project that's recently finished that we did that was led by James Hutton, where the entire 5-year duration of that project with 20 or so European partners was devoted to looking at which plant teams, which individual plants work very well together when you combine them in a polycultural approach to move away from that monocultural model. And we had some very interesting results with that. And if you do it in the right way, you could also look to stack benefits a little bit like we've done for flowering field margins, where you can try to get even more from that companion plant. So potentially a pest control benefit, but also a return for nitrogen, for example, or something that will benefit soil health in some way. And that's a link to a very nice series of short videos that came out from that project that's well worth having a look at if that's an area that's of interest. The last slide that I want to mention, and others may mention this too, is a field lab that we're just started at the moment. Last week we had the kickoff meeting at one of the farmer sites down near Thirsk, where we are looking at flower power for pest control and really hoping to design a network of field trials, and also looking at monitoring techniques on farm as well that would give anybody who's implementing a flowering field margin and hoping to get a pest control benefit from it, the tools to actually have a look themselves to see whether that system looks like it's working. And we've got a few sites there, mostly across the sort of north and northeast of England, looking at that project. Right, I'll leave it there. Hopefully that's given a good introduction, a good starting point for other talks and for some discussion later on in the webinar.
Great, thank you, Dave. Superb. A great example. As I said, we did have a session last week on trap cropping, as it happens, so perhaps we should have had you talking there as well. But one of the points that was raised there was someone anecdotally has noticed that cabbage white butterflies land on 3 flowers before they start to feed. So by spreading the feed sources across the field, you actually reduce the ability to them, or finding competition to find their food sources, to slow them down. I don't know whether that's true or not, but
it absolutely, it varies a bit depending on the pest insects. A lot of my early work was with Rosemary Collier and Stan Finch at Warwick, and they were working on cabbage root fly there. And cabbage root fly won't just lay an egg after landing on a single plant, and this is true of many other insects as well. It won't make that this is the right plant for me choice immediately. It needs to collect several what they called appropriate stimuli from many different plants in that immediate area before it actually says, right, this looks like a good site for laying an egg, and it will then hop off the plant and lay an egg in the soil. So if you put the right sorts of companion plants, and in fact this works just as well, and it was something I did for some of my studies while I was at Warwick. It works just as well, even if you use a fake plant, so a green plastic plant. As long as it's green, because the fly will land on it because it sees that it's green. And at this point, it's using quite a lot of visual cues to pick plants. It won't get the right stimulus when it hops onto that non-host plant, and it will more or less completely abort its process of host plant selection at that point and fly off elsewhere. So probably no good for the neighbors, but if you've got that system working, it can work quite well. It does vary by insect species, and certain other things like diamondback moth that I worked on quite early in my career tends to be a bit less selective. But if you've got a pest that you can confuse in that way, it works very well, or can do.
Brilliant. That's great. Anna's put the website addresses for the plant team's project, Diversified project, which is a superb resource for anybody who's looking at intercropping as well as all these other things, because it works on all the right things. There has been a comment in the chat to say that the other thing that we need to bear in mind is bats are also very useful means of control, particularly some of the more nasty moths and bigger flies and stuff. And so therefore anything we can do to support bats within the farmed environment is also going to be massively beneficial. So that's good. Right. If there's aren't any other questions, which there don't appear to be at the minute, we will move on to Julian. Julian farms near Oxford and has been doing various approaches for some time. So he's found his presentation, which is really good news.
Yeah.
Over to you, Julian.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Dave. So I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about what we're doing on Hendred Estate. So I manage a mainly cropping estate in Oxford, South Oxfordshire, combinable crops and sheep around cover crops. I suppose you could call me a regenerative agriculture. I'm not an organic farmer, a regenerative agricultural system, but probably more accurate using sort of addict terminology. I'm probably more accurately a recovering industrial agriculturalist, having spent most of my career being fairly focused on industrial agricultural systems. I've always been very into soil health. That's been a big driver right through my career, but it's only recently I've looked at the bigger picture. And one of the things I ask myself is why complicate nice, simple industrial farming there on the left, where it's all very simple, the wheat prairies that Dave showed, sort out all the problems with chemicals. Why complicate my life with biodiversity and complexity and homes for beneficials? Well, it was a few things really, two big things. Well, the obvious one is sprays don't work anymore. Basically standard biological rule, you spray things on pests and eventually they get resistant to them. And I had a big mindset change must have been about 12 years ago now. I got a beehive and suddenly it was all up close and personal. Instead of going out there with insecticide and it was just things in nature, suddenly it was my bees, it was my honey. And that really allowed me to flip the switch and get into looking at the whole ecosystem rather than just soil health. And an analogy that I really like to use is I see the whole ecosystems that we're working in my agricultural sort of production line as the factory premises, and somebody with a car factory automatically maintains their factory premises. Is, I'll say, haven't got a production line, whereas industrial agriculture, I feel, and the agriculture I've been practicing for probably the first 30 years of my career, hasn't been maintaining the factory premises, and really that's what I'm trying to do now. And this Homes for Beneficials is just one aspect of it. So that's the driver, really. So I've got two approaches. The first approach, they're two very simple approaches. Basically, I just don't spray against pests, and I don't even look for pest problems anymore. I mean, a lot of your pests are resistant to, now we've got rid of neonicotinoids and we're relying on synthetic pyrethroids. A lot of pests are getting resistant to them anyway. So why would you make the problem worse, the resistance problem, when they don't really work anyway? And also, I'm really wanting to build up that background of beneficials and pest predators on the farm. So I don't want to be squirting them with synthetic pyrethroids. I mean, you're squirting your bad aphids, but you're also squirting all your beneficials. And maybe you won't kill a big carabid beetle, but you're going to give it a headache. And, you know, all your generalists, your money spiders and things, you're going to be giving them a right caning with all these synthetic pyrethroid passes. So I tend to walk away from problems. And most of the time, I don't think it causes me any grief. My two worries are BYDV and pea and bean weevil in the spring. They're my two worries. I think virtually everything else, for example, things like bruchid beetle, the sprays don't work anyway. Cabbage stem flea beetle, the sprays don't work anyway. Why would you use them? So really, just stop spraying against pests. That would be my first tip. The second tip is to basically, as Dave was saying, build more biodiverse systems in amongst our industrial agriculture. And the classic one is these strips around the edge of fields. So we've got those going in. But then, as Dave alluded to, this getting the beneficials into the fields, we got involved with the ASSIST experiment, which is an experiment run by various organisations, CEH and Rothamsted, and it was a 5-year experiment. I think it's just about to be rolled on for another few years, all about sustainable intensification of agriculture. And one of the things was an experiment with 3 different fields in 3 different systems, and treatment 3 field, I haven't got time to go into great detail on the experiment, but treatment 3 field, which you can see here, has got flowering strips down the middle of the field as well as at the ends. So those strips are 3 tram lines apart, 90 metres. So in theory, your beneficials have only got to go 45 metres to do a bit of pest control. So rather than just having flowering strips down the sides of great big prairies and then still having to go and spray insecticides, we're hoping that actually the beneficials will do the job for us in this kind of system. That's what it looks like in the field. It's fantastic, breaking up the prairies. But the thing is, does it actually work? Well, I'm not an entomologist, so this is the first visual clue that it's doing something. This is a sticky trap in the middle of a wheat area, and there's lots of insects on there, but they're all pretty similar. They're all sort of black and they look the same to me, not being an entomologist. Dave could probably say what they were if he had a magnifying glass. But then another sticky trap close to the strips. The biodiversity on those sticky traps is absolutely unbelievable. You can't really see it very well on this, but basically there's pink, blue, red, orange, every different insect you can possibly imagine there, compared to the lack of biodiversity on the other sticky trap. So it's definitely bringing biodiversity to the party. Now, does it actually work economically? This is a Google Earth image of the 3 fields. I don't know if you can see my pointer moving. So this bottom left field, where you can see a lot of slug damage in oilseed rape, that's the control field with no strips. This top field, again, a lot of slug damage. That's got strips. That's treatment 2 field. That's got strips down the side. And then this treatment 3 field with no slug damage with the strips down the middle. So all these fields were identical points in the rotation. They had winter barley. The barley was harvested, the straw was chopped, and we direct drilled oilseed rape into the fields on the same day, same variety, same seed rate. the slugs came the 2 fields and not the middle one. So I thought, this is fantastic. The strips are helping us. So that's what it looked like on the ground. That was one of the slug ravaged fields. And that was, you can see the strip there down the middle of the field in August. So obviously, I think had we topped it then? Well, anyway, there's not much showing, but maybe we had. Actually, no, it's not August. This is much later. This is later in September, after we'd cut and removed the material off the strip. So again, that's good. Now, this is the data I managed to get off Ben Woodcock at CEH, because they're still chomping through all the data that they're getting from these assist experiments, because there's about 20 farms over a period of years, and they don't really want to put the data out until they've analysed it all properly. But I forced Ben to give me a bit of interim data on this field. And if you can see on that top graph there, we've got more large carabid beetles on treatment 3 field compared to the control and treatment 2. And again, there's some general calembulas, that's just showing a general indicator of soil health. They're increased again on the fields with the strips, and particularly on the field with the strips down the middle. I want this to work, so I can't say that this proves that the strips control my slugs, but I like to think that the extra population of carabid beetles control my slugs and potentially saved me money in slug pellets. In practice, I think we put a small prophylactic dressing on that treatment 3 field, and we did 3 treatments of ferric phosphate on the other 2 fields. Right, everything else is just pretty pictures. So on the back of the assist strips and on the back of my recovering industrial agriculturalist mindset, so I stopped spraying, and then basically I just want to, we've got big fields, we've got big wheat prairies. I just want to get as much biodiversity into the system as I can, and as many homes for as many different beneficials. I'm not an entomologist, so I don't particularly target particular beneficials. I just try and get as much biodiversity out there as I can. So you can see things, there's a strip here, an Edgefield strip with lots of umbellifers in, and there's another strip here with different things in. This strip down in the middle is pollen and nectar from legumes. So we're putting a lot more infield strips in our big prairies with countryside stewardship, and they're AB8s and AB1s, and we're rolling those out across the farm with the environmental schemes. This is another one where I tried to build the biodiversity and the 3-dimensionality of it all. So this is a north-south AB8 strip, countryside stewardship strip, that I made a little bit wider because of the pylon. And I thought, we've got a nice wide strip, let's do something else in it. So we've put a little trial. We've got a native hedge with lots of different species down the middle in one half of it, and we've got hazel coppice in another, with the idea is that it'll sort of build on the flowers, and it'll give us flowers and habitats at different times of the year. So it's basically just trying to build the biodiversity of the strips, which we've already taken out of production. We've already got environmental money for, so let's try and do a bit more with them. Cover crops, obviously that's different habitats, but it's amazing how many flowers we can get out of cover crops. This was a really good one this year, which the buckwheat started flowering really early in early September, and that things, particularly the oil radish, was still flowering in mid-November. So we've got a range of flowers at the end of the season. And this is just a sheep grazed one with, again, oil radish and different radishes flowering. Herbal lays, again, playing about with herbal lay and countryside stewardship. These are absolutely fantastic. People talk about woodland bathing. When this herbal lay was in full flower in June, my wife and myself, every evening, we'd go and do herbal lay bathing. We'd just walk into the middle of this field when the sun was still up, close your eyes, and the whole field was just buzzing. And literally there were insects in every single flower almost, particularly the blue flowers of the chicory. So again, building homes within our sort of predominantly industrial agriculture system. Hedges, so again, it's building that biodiversity. Here on the left, that's a new hedge in countryside stewardship, breaking up 2 big prairies. And here in the bottom right, that's gapping up hedges that aren't very good. So we're just trying to build it all. And again, Dave was talking about companion cropping. trying to get biodiversity into the field. So again, you know, in these systems here where you've got beans with oats, you know, you're hoping that their build of things like black bean aphids are slowed by them getting a bit confused because they've got oats in the mix. And likewise, beans are confusing the crown rust in oats and things. So it's all just helping with pest diseases, hopefully. The big one here is the oilseed rape one, because we don't do any spraying for cabbage stem flea beetle now. And obviously we haven't got neonics, and they can be a problem. But if we use home save rapeseed and we put berseem clover or another companion with it, I personally don't think the companions stop the flea beetle attacking the rape. But if the flea beetle do attack the rape, we can abandon it as a crop, leave it as an overwinter cover crop because you've got the berseem clover there, and then just put a spring crop in. So you've got a cheap crop because you haven't bought seed. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. A couple more slides. One of the big things I think about is the monitoring. Everybody likes to have electronic ways of monitoring things. So last year or the year before, we managed to play around. Somebody lent us this Meteos Eye Scout. So sticky traps, usually used in like a more high value greenhouse environment with a camera, and it can recognize and count the populations of usually pests. And I was playing around with it here. I was trying to see if I could get flea beetles. These were the fields that we planted rape in. I was trying to see if I could count flea beetles hopping in there. I was just playing around with it. But I think the real potential use in the future with IPM, it's all about, it seems to me, it's all about thresholds. So say, for example, you've got a field of beans and you've got black bean aphids and 10% of plants infected with aphids. So, oh, we've checked and we've done IPM principles, but we've reached threshold, so let's go and spray. But if you could somehow be monitoring the buildup of the beneficials, ladybirds and lacewings and things, parasitic wasps, whatever, and you've got a machine like this, maybe counting them and sending back to your computer in the farm office, and it might go, whoa, 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 hang on a minute, Julian, you've reached a threshold, don't spray for a minute because all your beneficials are building up, give it 2 or 3 days, and the problem might go away. And that would give people the confidence to actually back away from thresholds a bit and just let the beneficials have a chance to do something. The very last slide is just about BYDV. This slide just reminds me to talk about it. We're trying to drill later, but obviously with the wet winters we've been having, it's worrying drilling later. I'm helped because I've got a 10-meter CTF system, so I don't do much soil damage even if it's wet. So that gives me the confidence working wide on controlled traffic lanes because I know where my wheeling damage is. But it worries me. This year, we just used up, all I sprayed this year was 2 fields of barley to use up some old insecticide I had in my spray store, which hopefully I'll never buy any insecticide ever again. And we didn't spray anything else for BYDV, even though it was a mild autumn. But I do worry. I've been caught with BYDV about 35 years ago on a farm on the Salisbury Plain, wiped out a 100-acre field of barley virtually completely. And you don't forget your cropping disasters. So I do worry about BYDV. And I do think if you're going to use any insecticide, an autumn insecticide against BYDV aphids when things aren't flowering and there's no beneficials around, is probably the least damaging time to use an insecticide. But personally, I want to try and get away from that one as well. That's me done. You're muted, Jerry.
How embarrassing. Oops, the technology is not a good combination. Thank you. Good job you found that presentation. That's actually superb. Just a question from Charlotte. I think you touched on some of it, but financial incentives for doing this. Have there been any? Are there any? Was it just, have you actually got financial benefit from doing it without the incentives? That whole question.
No, this is a problem, isn't it? This is a problem with regen ag, as Angus will know. There's no short-term financial benefit really. And the countryside stewardship AB8 strips are costing me money. I costed it out a while back. I'm getting about £500 a hectare for them, and they're costing me about £900 a hectare because I'm putting them on down the middle of the fields. I'm putting them on wheatland which can grow a 12-ton wheat crop, they're costing me money in the short term. And this is a problem with farming. This is a problem with, farming. Part of the problem with cabbage stem flea beetle are these weak rate rotations that went on for years because farmers were going for short-term profit. And because if you're working against biological systems, eventually the wheels drop off. And I can see the big picture and I can see the long-term benefit of having a sustainable system. And once the penny's dropped, and again, going back to this factory premises analogy, I can't keep running my production line without maintaining my factory premises, because one day the roof's going to cave in, which it's starting to. We're going to have no pesticides at work anymore because all the weeds, fungal diseases and insect pests will be resistant to everything. And the system just breaks down catastrophically. So I'm ensuring that my system doesn't break down and it's robust going into the future, but it's costing me money in the short term. I admit that.
Thank you for that. We know that everybody from us and all the organisations involved with this project and Regen Farmers are all pressurising government to make sure that ELMS and SFI pays properly for these sort of actions, because they're the ones that we want to be moving forward. I'm going to move on now to Angus Gowthorpe. One of the criticisms that often said about us southern softies is that we do all this stuff down in the south, but I farm in the north. It's cold, it's wet, it's different up here, and you spend all that time working on these species that work there. We've got here Angus, the farmer, who is taking on these challenges of the farming systems that Julian's been explaining, but is based in the north of England. So partly to demonstrate that we can actually move in this direction, but we maybe have to think very slightly differently. So I'd hand over to Angus and get the questions going. We'll get a discussion going between everybody as we move on.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everybody. Right. So boosting beneficials on the farm. Just took this snap. Actually, Dave was with me, I think, at the time back in spring. Spring beans just nicely coming up, and nice hungry ladybird there, looking for some prey. Come on. Thank you. Right, as Jerry alluded to, we're in the north. We farm 6 miles south of York, in the Vale of York. We're a mixed farm, so range of crops, diverse range of crops, including catch crops and cover crops within the rotation. We've got a 40 cow pedigree slice suckler herd as well. So we've moved away from ryegrass lays. We've moved through ryegrass and white clover, ryegrass and red clover, and we're now primarily onto herbal lays. The range of soils from blowaway sand through medium lowlands clays. We've managed to raise, since we started our journey in Regen Ag in 2014, we've raised the sands up to 4%, the clays up to 8% organic matter. And sort of Regen Ag seems to become a bit of a dirty word just recently. I think there's probably been maybe a bit too much of it in the press, turned a lot of people away from it. So more refer to ourselves as farming with nature and use biology to do so. As Julian's alluded to, with minimal soil disturbance with no-till drilled ever since we started, and long diverse rotation, diverse cover crops, and maintaining soil armour at all times. By doing all this, we're not disturbing the pests. We're not disturbing the beneficials within their own habitat in the centre of the field. So those that are overwintering in the centre of the fields, we're not disturbing them at all, and we're giving them a home to live. I've just borrowed this slide from Kelly Jowett. So we talk about habitats. So we're ticking the boxes pretty much with everything on here. We've got a lot of mature hedgerows, and wherever we've got gaps, we're gapping up currently under one of our mid-tier stewardship scheme. We've got grass margins around most of the fields, particularly next to every water course, and we've just where the stewardship scheme will allow, we drill wildflowers into some of those grass margins. We've got nectar flower in some of the fields. And although we haven't got ponds, we've got a dike running right the way through the home farm. We've got diverse swards, i.e. the herbal lays. And because we mob graze those herbal lays, they are constantly flowering. And as Julian said, between the herbal lays and the cover crops and the margins, we've got flowers virtually 9 months of the year. So we're doing as much as we can to benefit the pollinators. So just moving on to the field lab, as Dave mentioned, that we just started this spring. We're aiming to boost pollinator numbers as well as predatory insects. So we're not just concentrating just on the predatories. The primary pest concerns within the group are of the obvious cabbage stem flea beetle, aphids for BYDV, and bruchid beetle in the beans. Initially, we're assessing what flowers and grasses are present, and we're going to be trialing a new app that's being developed for mobile phone picture identification of some of those flowers. Monitoring using sticky traps, pitfall traps, water traps, are also sweep netting, and we've managed to get hold of a moth trap, provided the light bulb works. We'll be monitoring the insect numbers and the amount of crop damage where there's beneficial features and where there isn't, so we've got that comparison. One of the members is farming organically, so we've got the opportunity to compare organic to conventional and look and see if there's benefits from the regenerative farming, i.e. one thing that particularly interests me is where we're not disturbing the soil at all, are the beneficials there throughout the whole field, rather than just within the 50-metre strip that has been identified in previous work, where maybe other than Julian, primarily this work has been done on conventionally farmed land where the soil has been disturbed once every 12 months with maximum tillage. Just to add on, we haven't used any insecticides on farm at all for the last 3 to 4 years. Just decided to stop using them whatsoever. That includes no seed treatments whatsoever, and we use a very much minimum amount of synthetic fungicides. We're using biology for our fungicides instead of and nutrition instead of synthetic fungicides. We've only used one on one crop once in the last 2 years. And just lastly, we're trying not to destroy habitats or poison the beneficial insects and leave the numbers to build up to a level where they're doing it all for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. Thank you, Angus. The trial, obviously I know about the trial, but other people don't. Are you guys, as the farmers, going to be the one doing the pest recognition, or is that going to be down to the researcher?
We're collecting the samples and then they are being sent off to a lab to be analysed.
I'm sort of highlighting it because there's a very famous regenerative farmer who posted on Twitter one day something he wanted to know what it was, only to be told quite enthusiastically by everybody it was a ladybird larvae. So one of the things we need to know as farmers is perhaps we need to learn what we've got, and as you said, using the app for pattern recognition, and also very useful for us to start recognising the insects we're finding, as Julian has found a great little picture of the trap there.
Yeah.
So what within the trial, just pick up a little bit on the trial. So the idea is also to be planting different plant species as well, or is it just simply the analysis of what's going on?
We're all at sort of different stages. I've drilled mine last September, so that's drilling wildflower mixture into an existing tussocky grass margins. Primarily, one is completely new, so that was drilled into bare stubble. So that was a tussocky grass and flower mixture. Others are needing to refresh what they've already got, and one is starting afresh completely.
Right, Brilliant. So we're going to have a range of people involved in this. So it's a really good example of farmer-led research and using experience and finding different stages in the process. It's not a criticism of researchers, but as a comment that Julian made earlier on, is that trying to grab the research off the researcher because the evidence is so useful, even if it is something that farmers are really keen on getting answers very, very quickly. Research, I know you have to be statistically accurate when you present it. So trying to find a balance between the two is a massive problem.
Can I just chip in there, Jerry, because I think there's a lot of researchers on this evening, or quite a few. Please, when you've used a farm or a farmer for research, please come back to them with the results and what you've found. So many, we get Julian and I and others that have stuck our heads above the parapet. People have been on farm, dug soil up, counted insects, etc., etc., etc. Disappear, and you never hear a dicky bird. We want to hear the results. We want to know what's going on. Then we can improve our systems. But you can badger away, but you never get results. So please, if you're doing research involving farmers, feedback to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And even a bad result is a learning experience for a farmer. Julian made that point earlier on just now. Stephanie's asked a question interesting again. Would you make comments about the economics? And are you the same as Julian, costing you up front now for hopeful benefits later?
I would hope that the grass margins that we've got in around the farm and we've enhanced with the flower strips, we're getting a payment through the mid-tier scheme, and for me it's a personal desire. I want to have them, and I don't want to use insecticides. I will not use insecticides. So there is a financial payback for them, for me, from government for the mid-tier, and from me not needing to use insecticides. But as Julian alludes to, putting infield strips in, that's a step further. I mean, the margins around the fields, they're serving many purposes, including LERAP and buffer zones under LERAP requirements, which we need for government. So that's fine, but infield strips are another matter.
Yeah, and the cost. Julian.
So can I come in on that as well?
Yeah.
It's all about, like, I could very easily just take the environmental money and put strips around the edge of fields and on shaded edges, but the flower strips wouldn't work then, but it wouldn't cost you very much money in lost crop. But because to make them work, I'm putting them into the fields, but then it's costing me a lot of money in lost crop. But potentially the future benefits, there's other benefits coming. For example, if we start to get paid for natural capital, and even carbon sequestration, my strips that are about 10 meters wide with hedges and hazel coppice on as well, the biodiversity benefits on those and the carbon capture benefits. So I feel that it's worth taking the plunge now, and I feel it will definitely pay off at some point. And I think it will start to pay off. It might have been wishful thinking, because those big carabid number beetles and the lack of slug damage in that field, I realise that correlation isn't necessarily causation, and it might be wishful thinking, but my gut feel is that if I can get these going in the middle of my fields, it will help gradually, and it will lower use of things like slug pellets, and it will do the natural control of particularly things like aphids with ladybirds and things. So it's going for the long burn, and it's looking at the big picture. But you could really play the system and take the environmental payments and sort of pay lip service to put in biodiversity and habitats in. But there's a difference between paying lip service and doing a proper job.
Yeah, Dave.
I can add to that. Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital, because even once you've got those margins in to get them to deliver those benefits, I guess you almost have to manage them and look at them as being a crop in many ways. You sort of saw the images of the margins that had been mown and the actual clippings taken away as well, to help them, give them that level of longevity and make sure they stay diverse with the different things that have been sown being able to persist there. So I think, yes, I'd completely agree. And with that you have got to have that, I guess, almost that extra level of investment in them. If you just put it in to get the to get the sort of the payments, you won't get back what you could do from them.
No. The long-term benefits we hope are better. I think it's also fascinating, Julian, your example there, where actually you're using the pylon through the field as the line, so you don't have to avoid it. And I know you use controlled traffic. We've also seen people on veg crops growing wildflowers in the tram lines because they don't harvest it, so they're getting the same benefits by growing a wildflower mixes through the middle. On the economic thing, and the question is, what species or flowers is the best choices? What have you got on with? What works for you, Julian and Angus? In your own cases, what have you been putting in? And Dave, which ones? You're not going to say which one works best. You're in different areas and different things. You've already commented there's no best, but what sort of things does someone who's giving it a go start off with in the first instance?
Who wants to go first? Okay, I'll go. I'm not a specialist. A few comments on species. I sort of the original assist strips, they'd worked out what species to put in. And then with my AB8 strips, I bought off the shelf mixes. But what I've found is in a very fertile situation like we've got, there's too much, the grass predominates and there's too much grass in the off the shelf mixes. So again, because I want to do the job properly, in year 2 on the AB8 ones for countryside stewardship, I went back and put 100%, a top up of 100% perennial flowers on top to try and get more flowers going, because I felt they were quickly going to get swamped by grasses. And I've tried different mixes. The things that I find work seems to come really well. I showed a picture of a side field strip with a lot of umbellifers in it, and they seem to grow really well and seem to work better than the flowers, more diverse flowers. And apparently, again, Dave will put me right on this, but umbellifers are quite good as a pollen and nectar source, I think. So the umbellifer strips, I think, are quite useful and they're quite easy to work with. The other ones that are quite easy, but I don't think they're very good, are the AB1s, the clover, the pollen and nectar from the clovers. They're really easy to sow and manage, but I don't think they're as good for beneficials.
Yes, I can add to that. I mean, in some ways, if you're providing anything that's providing shelter, it's likely to have a benefit. And we briefly mentioned things like beetle banks, where you'd have tussocky grass mixes specifically to try and encourage carabid beetles, usually raised up, that were sort of, I guess, a lot more than around a few years ago. But you do within those flowers that you can select from. Certainly something like the umbellifers have got quite an open flower, so it's generally the resources they provide are both generally quite good quality, but also relatively easily accessible. Whereas you might have things like clover that are more targeted, so you'll get certain bees that will readily feed from clover, but there's not necessarily going to provide that benefit, that floral resource to other groups. And you've got, again, some of the classic examples that you might find in seed mixes, things like cornflower, for example, which you'll find in quite a few, and certainly vetches as well. Certain vetches will even provide a nectar resource that's not through the flower. It's something called extra floral nectar, which sort of comes out from where the leaf joins onto the stem and that kind of thing. And that resource is available to anything, regardless of what its mouth parts might be structured like. And you could probably imagine that something like a very long-tongued bumblebee or a butterfly with a big long proboscis feeds from very different flowers than something with much simpler mouth parts like a hoverfly that might be more sort of trying to mop that nectar up. I think in general we have conducted studies where we've just recently done it for our own farms in Newcastle, where we've taken a very sort of bespoke approach to which individual flowering species and then which mixtures of those species we think would work well for the production systems that we're in terms of the rotations, the soils, what our farm director really wants from and we've done this both for cover crops and for flowering field margin seed mixes. I guess